The smell of antiseptic and industrial-grade lavender was the first thing that returned to her, a sharp, cold greeting that heralded a world of white light and muffled sounds. When Clara opened her eyes, the world was a blur of high-ceilinged shadows and the rhythmic, mocking tick of a wall clock. Her head felt like it had been split open and stitched back together with heavy thread. Beside her, a man sat, his head buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a silent, rhythmic grief. He looked older than he should, his hair unkempt, his wedding ring glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. When she let out a dry, raspy cough, the man bolted upright. His eyes, red-rimmed and desperate, flooded with a sudden agonizing hope. He reached for her hand, his voice a broken whisper. "Clara." "Oh God, Clara, you're back." Clara pulled her hand away, shrinking into the stiff hospital pillows. The movement was instinctive, a recoil from a stranger. "I'm sorry," she croaked, her throat feeling like it was lined with glass. Do I know you? Where is Julian? Is he outside?" The man's face didn't just fall, it shattered. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. He looked at her as if she were a ghost, or perhaps he was the one who fell dead. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Finally, he whispered, "Clara, it's Elias. We've been married for 6 years. Julian hasn't been in your life for a very long time." But in Clara's mind, it was 7 years ago. The last thing she remembered was a heated argument with Julian in a rain-slicked parking lot, the passion, the fire, the beautiful toxic mess of their relationship. To her, Elias was a stranger who had somehow stolen a decade of her life. The weeks that followed were a grueling exercise in domestic haunting. Elias brought her home to a house she didn't recognize, filled with photos of a woman who looked like her but possessed a smile she couldn't remember feeling happy. He was patient, devastatingly so. He cooked the meals he said she loved, played the music they had danced to at their wedding, and sat across the room from her with a look of quiet, enduring devotion that made her skin crawl with guilt.
Then came Julian. He had heard about the accident, of course. He appeared at the door one afternoon while Elias was at work, looking exactly as he did in her memories, vibrant, reckless, and smelling of leather and expensive cigarettes. When Clara saw him, the hole in her chest seemed to fill instantly. This was the man she remembered loving. This was the person who held the keys to the world she understood. "I heard you forgot," Julian said, his voice a low, familiar velvet. He stepped inside without being asked, his presence commanding and familiar. "I heard you finally forgot that stranger you were living with. Maybe the universe is giving us a second chance, Clara." In the days that followed, Clara began to live 2 lives. By day, she wandered the house with Elias, feeling the weight of his kindness like a leaden shroud. He would tell her stories of their life, of the time they hiked the Alps, of the quiet Tuesdays they spent gardening, of the way she had once told him he was her anchor. But to Clara, these weren't memories. They were scripts for a play she didn't want to perform. By evening, she would meet Julian in secret. He took her to the dive bars they used to frequent, filled her head with the true history of their romance, and told her that Elias was nothing more than a rebound she had settled for because she was tired of fighting for the real thing. Clara found herself falling back into the old rhythms, the adrenaline, the uncertainty, the magnetic pull of a man who demanded everything from her. Julian was a fire, and after the cold, sterile reality of the hospital, Clara wanted to burn. Elias knew. He had to know. He saw the way her eyes lit up when the phone buzzed, the way she pulled away from his touch with increasing frequency. Yet he never shouted. He never demanded she stop. He simply grew thinner, quieter, a man watching his entire universe collapse in slow motion. One night, the tension finally reached its breaking point. Elias was working late, and Julian had come over to the house, emboldened by Clara's growing affection. They sat on the sofa Elias had bought for her as a birthday gift, and Julian leaned in close, his hand sliding up her arm. "Leave him, Clara," Julian whispered, his breath hot against her neck. "Pack a bag tonight. This house, this life, it isn't you. You're the girl who climbed fences with me. You're the girl who lived for the moment. Don't let this man bury you in his boredom. He doesn't know the real you. Only I do." He moved to kiss her, his eyes full of a predatory triumph. He was certain he had won.
But as his face drew closer, a strange, jagged memory flickered in the back of Clara's mind. It wasn't a photo or a story Elias had told. It was a feeling, a cold, sickening dread in the pit of her stomach. She looked at Julian, really looked at him, and for the first time since the accident, the fog shifted. She pulled back, her voice trembling but clear. "Julian, wait." He smiled, a confident, easy grin. "What is it, babe? Don't be scared. We're finally going home." Clara looked around the room, at the books on the shelves, the small succulents in the window that Elias carefully watered every morning, the way the light hit the rug. Then she looked back at Julian, the man who represented everything her memory told her she wanted. "I have one question," Clara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. Julian chuckled, leaning back, his hand still possessively on her knee. "Anything. Ask me anything." Clara took a deep breath. "If we were so happy, and if you are the only one who truly knows me, why is it that in every single memory I have of us, I am crying?" The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's smile didn't just fade, it evaporated. His hand stayed on her knee, but the warmth was gone. He opened his mouth to give one of his classic silver-tongued excuses, to tell her that passion always comes with tears, that their love was intense, but the words died in his throat. He looked at her, and for a split second, the mask of the romantic hero slipped, revealing the same manipulative, selfish man who had broken her years ago. He couldn't answer, because he knew. He remembered the arguments, the gaslighting, the way he had diminished her until she was a shadow of herself. He remembered that she hadn't left him because of a mistake. She had left him to survive. In that silence, the front door opened. Elias walked in, looking exhausted, his coat damp from the rain. He stopped in the doorway, seeing them together. He didn't move, he didn't speak. He just looked at Clara with a profound, weary sadness, waiting for the final blow. Clara stood up, moving away from Julian as if he were a poisonous thing. She looked at the man by the door, the stranger who had spent weeks being her ghost, her nurse, and her silent protector. "Julian was just leaving," Clara said, her voice cracking. Julian stood, his face darkening with a sudden, ugly anger. "You're making a mistake, Clara. You'll be bored within a month. You'll be begging for the fire again." "I don't want to burn anymore, Julian," Clara replied, her eyes fixed on Elias. "I want to be able to breathe." As Julian slammed the door behind him, the house settled into a different kind of quiet. Elias still hadn't moved. He was afraid to hope. He was afraid that if he spoke, the spell would break and she would go back to not knowing who he was. Clara walked across the room. She stood in front of him, seeing the lines around his eyes and the wedding ring that he had never taken off. She didn't have her memories back, not all of them. The 7-year gap was still a vast, dark ocean. But she realized that memory wasn't just about facts and dates. It was about the body knowing where it was safe. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and took his hand. This time she didn't pull away. "I don't remember our wedding," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "I don't remember the Alps or the gardening. I don't remember your name most mornings." Elias closed his eyes, his forehead leaning against hers. "I know," he choked out. "But, Elias," she said, pulling him closer, "I remember how it feels when you look at me, and I think
I think I'd like to fall in love with you all over again, if you'll have me." Elias didn't answer with words. He simply gathered her into his arms and held her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world, while outside the world kept turning, and inside the long, slow work of remembering began, not with the mind, but with the heart. In the months that followed, the real-life struggle of their recovery was anything but cinematic. It was messy. It was hard. Clara struggled with bouts of depression and the haunting sense that she was an imposter in her own life. Julian tried to call, tried to send letters, playing on her lingering confusion, but Clara had established a rule. Every time she felt the pull of the past, she would ask Elias for a new memory.
They began to build a second life on top of the ruins of the first. They didn't go back to the old restaurants. They found new ones. They didn't talk about who she was. They talked about who she wanted to be now. Evelyn, Clara's therapist, told her that the brain sometimes shuts down parts of the past to protect the future. "Maybe you didn't just lose your memory," Evelyn suggested during one session. "Maybe you gave yourself a clean slate because you knew you were strong enough to choose the right man a second time." One evening, nearly a year after the accident, Elias found Clara in the garden. She was kneeling in the dirt, planting a row of lavender, the same scent that had once signaled her trauma in the hospital. Now it was just a flower. She looked up at him, her face flushed with the sun. "Elias?" "Yeah?" "I remembered something today." He stilled, his heart skipping. "What was it?" She smiled, and it was a smile he recognized from 1,000 old photos, full, bright, and completely hers. "I remembered the way you take your coffee. 2 sugars, 1 cream, but only if it's poured after the sugar so it dissolves properly." Elias laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. It was a small thing, a tiny fragment of a lost world, but as he knelt in the dirt beside her, he knew it was enough. The fire of the past had gone out, leaving behind something much more durable, the steady, quiet warmth of a home that didn't need a memory to be real. The question she had asked Julian, the one about the tears, became their private anchor. Whenever things got difficult, whenever the shadow of her lost years grew too long, Elias would look at her and say, "Are you crying?" And Clara, leaning into him, would always give the same answer. "No. For the first time, I think I've finally forgotten how." The ex-husband, the ghost of her youth, eventually faded into a bitter story he told people at bars about the woman who lost her mind. But Clara didn't lose her mind. She had found it in the one place she never expected, in the arms of a stranger who had loved her enough to let her forget him until she was ready to remember why she stayed. The piece they had built was a fragile glass sculpture, beautiful but trembling in the wake of a storm that refused to fully dissipate. While Julian had been physically banished from their home, his presence lingered like a persistent cold. He was the ghost in the static of a phone call, the shadow in the corner of a crowded street. For Elias, the victory felt hollow at times. Every time Clara hesitated before calling him by his name, or every time she spent too long staring at an old photograph as if trying to solve a complex puzzle, a cold blade of doubt twisted in his chest. He wondered if he was a husband or merely a preferred caretaker. He wondered if she loved him or if she was simply terrified of the man who made her cry. The turning point came on a Tuesday in late November, a day that smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Clara had started working part-time at a local library, a quiet job that allowed her to reconnect with the world at her own pace. As she was shelving books in the back corner, a shadow fell across the aisle. "You look different in the light," a voice said. Clara's heart seized. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Julian. He looked haggard, his charm replaced by a desperate, jagged edge. He didn't come with flowers or leather jackets this time. He came with a folder. "I found these,"
Julian said, thrusting the folder toward her. "Letters you wrote me, before you met him, before you decided to play it safe. Read them, Clara. Remember the girl who wanted to see the world burn. That girl didn't want a garden. She wanted me." Clara took the folder, her fingers numb. For a moment, the old magnetic pull, the dangerous, dizzying gravity of Julian threatened to drag her back under. She opened the folder and saw her own handwriting, younger and more frantic, filled with declarations of a love that sounded more like a fever than a choice. She read the words, "Without you, I feel nothing. Even the pain is better than the silence." Julian stepped closer, his voice a low, urgent prayer. "He's a good man, Clara, I'll give you that. But he's a sedative. You're living in a waiting room. Come back to the fire." Clara looked at the letters, then at Julian. She waited for the spark. She waited for the fire to ignite in her veins. But all she felt was a profound, overwhelming sense of exhaustion. She looked at Julian, at the man who had kept these letters like trophies of a war he refused to admit he had lost. "You're right, Julian," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet library. "I was that girl. I recognize the handwriting, and I recognize the desperation." Julian's eyes flared with a sudden, triumphant light. "I knew it. I knew you were still in there." "But Julian," she continued, closing the folder with a deliberate snap, "that girl wrote those letters because she thought love had to be a struggle. She thought that if it didn't hurt, it wasn't real. She was a child who didn't know the difference between a hearth and a house fire." She stepped past him, handing the folder back. "Elias isn't a sedative. He's the reason I don't need one. He didn't find me in the fire. He was the one waiting for me when I finally crawled out of it. You don't love me, Julian. You love the girl who was broken enough to think she needed you." Julian stood frozen in the aisle, the letters clutched in his hand. The question she had asked him weeks ago, "Why am I always crying in my memories?" finally received its silent answer. He wasn't her great love. He was her great lesson. That evening, when Elias came to pick her up, he found her sitting on the steps of the library, watching the first few flakes of snow drift down through the street lamps. He pulled the car to the curb, his face etched with the familiar, quiet concern that had become her favorite thing in the world. She didn't wait for him to open the door. She walked to the driver's side, leaned through the window, and kissed him. A kiss that wasn't about the past or the future, but about the solid, breathing present. "Julian came to see me today," she said as she climbed into the passenger seat. Elias's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his jaw setting. "Clara, He brought letters," she interrupted, reaching over to place her hand on his. "Old letters I wrote to him. They were full of passion and pain." Elias looked at her, his eyes searching hers for the inevitable "but." "And I realized something," Clara said, smiling at him. "I realized that I don't miss that girl. I don't even know her anymore. And Elias, I don't want to remember her. I'm too busy being the woman you love." The tension in Elias's shoulders didn't just fade, it evaporated. He let out a long, shaky breath he seemed to have been holding for 7 years. He pulled her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his eyes damp. They drove home in a comfortable, healing silence. That night, for the first time since the accident, Clara didn't dream of white hospital walls or rain-slicked parking lots. She dreamed of a house with a blue door, a garden that smelled of lavender, and a man whose name her mind had forgotten, but whose soul her heart had always known. Memory, she realized, was a fickle thing. It could be stolen by a trauma or erased by a blow to the head, but the way a person makes you feel, the sense of safety, the absence of tears, the quiet permission to simply breathe, that was written in a language that no accident could ever delete.
Julian eventually left town, moving on to find another fire to stoke. But in the small house with the blue door, the lavender grew thick and fragrant. And whenever people asked Clara about her amnesia, she would simply smile and tell them the same thing. I didn't lose my past, I just finally stopped letting it get in the way of my life. The man who had been a stranger was now the only world she needed. And for the first time in her life, Clara wasn't just surviving the storm, she was the one who had finally come home. The transition from healing to living was not a single leap, but a series of quiet, often painful steps. As the winter deepened, the world outside the house with the blue door became a landscape of stark whites and long blue shadows. Inside, the battle shifted from the spectacular drama of Julian's interference to the mundane, grind-in reality of a life built on a void. Clara began to realize that memory was not just about the big moments, the weddings, the arguments, the accidents, but the thousands of tiny threads that connect a person to their community. She found herself standing in the grocery store, staring at a neighbor who was waving enthusiastically, her mind a frantic, empty room. She had to learn to navigate the social topography of a woman she no longer was. She discovered, through awkward conversations over coffee, that the old Clara had been a high-strung corporate lawyer who lived on caffeine and adrenaline. The new Clara, who loved the silence of the library and the slow growth of lavender, felt like an imposter inhabiting a stranger's skin. Elias remained her constant, but she began to notice the toll her amnesia had taken on him. One evening, she found him in his home office, his head resting on a stack of medical bills and insurance forms. The lamp cast a harsh light on the gray that had begun to salt his temples. He looked not just tired, but diminished.
"Elias," she whispered, stepping into the room. He jumped slightly, quickly shuffling the papers into a drawer. He offered her a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, just catching up on some work." Clara walked over and leaned against the desk. "You don't have to hide it from me. I know I'm an expensive project." Elias stood up and pulled her into his arms, but for the first time, she felt a slight hesitation in him. "You aren't a project, Clara. You're my wife." "Am I?" she asked, pulling back to look at him. "Or am I just a woman you're taking care of because you feel obligated to the person I used to be?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Elias looked away, his jaw tightening. "That's not fair, Clara." "I know it's not," she said, her voice trembling. "But I see how you look at me sometimes. You're looking for her. You're looking for the woman who knew your jokes before you told them. You're looking for the woman who shared 6 years of history with you. And I can't find her. I've looked everywhere, Elias. She's gone." Elias finally looked at her, and the raw vulnerability in his expression made her breath hitch. "I'm not looking for her," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm mourning her. There's a difference." That night they slept in the same bed, but a vast, invisible canyon lay between them. Clara realized that by choosing Elias, she had only won the first battle. The war was against the grief of a man who had lost his wife while she was still sitting right in front of him. A few days later, while Elias was at work, Clara decided to do something she had avoided since the hospital. She went into the attic. She needed to find the woman Elias was mourning. She found a trunk labeled Clara, Private. Inside were journals, old planners, and a shoebox full of mementos. She spent hours on the dusty floor, reading the words of her past self. She saw the descent into the Julian years, the frantic, jagged handwriting of a woman losing her mind to a toxic love. She saw the transition when Elias entered her life. The handwriting became steadier, the entries more grounded. But she also saw the struggle. She read about her own bouts of guilt, her fear that she was too broken for a man as stable as Elias.
In the very bottom of the trunk, she found a small digital recorder. She pressed play. "It's August 14th. The voice, her voice, said, "I had another nightmare about Julian tonight. I woke up screaming, and Elias, he just held me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me to get over it. He just stayed until the sun came up. I don't know why he stays. I don't know why he loves a ghost. But I'm going to try. I'm going to try to be whole for him." Clara sat in the silence of the attic, the recorder humming in her hand. She realized that she had been so focused on what she had lost that she had forgotten what Elias had been doing for years. He hadn't just been her husband for 6 years. He had been her sanctuary. He had spent years helping her heal from Julian long before the accident ever happened. She realized then that Julian's fire hadn't just been a memory. It had been a trauma that Elias had spent a lifetime helping her outrun. The accident had merely finished the job that Elias had started. It had burned away the last of the poison, but it had taken the memories of the antidote with it. When Elias came home that evening, he found the house filled with the scent of a complex, spicy stew, a recipe Clara had found in one of her old journals. She was standing in the kitchen, wearing an old apron, her hair tied back. "You're cooking?" he asked, surprised. "I'm trying," she said, turning to him. She walked over to him and took his hands. She looked at the man who had loved a ghost, a trauma victim, and an amnesiac, all without ever asking for anything in return. "I went into the attic today," she said. Elias stiffened. "Clara, you didn't have to do that." "I did," she replied. "I needed to know who I was, but more importantly, I needed to know who you were to me." She led him to the dining table where she had set out the recorder and the journals. "I heard the tapes, Elias. I know how much work it was to love me even before the accident. I know how many nights you stayed up while I screamed about a man who didn't deserve a single one of my tears." Elias sat down, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't want you to remember that part. I wanted you to have the clean slate." "But a clean slate is empty," Clara said, kneeling beside his chair. "I don't want an empty life, Elias. I want a real one. And a real life has scars. I've been so afraid of the gap in my memory that I didn't see the man who was filling it with himself." She reached up and touched his face. "You aren't mourning me, Elias, because I'm right here. I'm the woman who wrote those journals, and I'm the woman who was saved by you. The accident didn't change that. It just made me forget how lucky I was." Elias finally let the tears fall, leaning his head against her shoulder. For the first time in a year, the ghost of the old Clara and the stranger of the new Clara merged into a single, breathing woman. The recovery continued, but the canyon between them began to close. They stopped trying to recover the past and started focusing on investing in the future. Clara returned to the law, but not as a corporate shark. She began working in advocacy, using her skills to help others escape the kind of toxic cycles she had once been trapped in. As for Julian, he became a footnote, a shadow that occasionally crossed her mind, but one that no longer held any power. She knew now that the passion he offered was just a lack of peace, and the fire he promised was just a slow-motion destruction. One spring morning, as the first green shoots of the lavender began to peek through the soil, Clara stood in the garden. She looked at the house with the blue door and the man inside, who was currently burning the toast and laughing at himself. She realized that memory is a story we tell ourselves about who we are. And while she might never remember the first 6 years of their marriage, she would always remember the year she chose him twice. She would remember the man who was willing to be a stranger if it meant she could be safe. She walked back inside, the smell of burnt bread and fresh coffee greeting her. Elias looked up, his eyes bright and full of the steady, quiet warmth that was her new definition of love. "Is it edible?" she asked, gesturing to the toast. "Technically, no," Elias said, grinning, "but it's made with a lot of devotion." Clara laughed, and the sound echoed through the house, filling every empty corner of her forgotten years. She didn't need a memory to know that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was home, and for the first time she wasn't looking back to see if anything was following her. She was finally, completely, looking forward. The shift from a life defined by recovery to a life defined by purpose happened during a rainy Tuesday in the city's legal aid office. Clara, now a permanent fixture in the advocacy center, sat across from a woman named Sarah. Sarah was 24, with bruised wrists hidden beneath long sleeves and the hollow, haunted eyes of someone who was constantly calculating the nearest exit.
"He says he loves me," Sarah whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "He says that the passion we have, it's just too big for the world. That's why we fight. That's why he loses control. He says he's the only one who really knows me." Clara felt a cold, familiar shiver. It was like hearing a script she had once memorized. She looked down at Sarah's file, then reached across the table and placed her hand over the younger woman's trembling fingers. "I'm going to tell you something that took me 10 years and a total loss of my memory to understand," Clara said, her voice steady and resonant. "Passion that requires you to be afraid is not love. It's a hostage situation. The man who really knows you shouldn't be the man who makes you cry every night. You deserve a man who is so safe, he's almost boring. You deserve to be bored, Sarah. It's the most beautiful feeling in the world." As she spoke, Clara realized that she wasn't just helping Sarah, she was finally closing the door on the woman she used to be. The old Clara had been a victim of Julian's fire, and the new Clara was the architect of her own peace. When she returned home that evening, the house was quiet. Elias wasn't in the kitchen. She found him on the back porch, staring out at the darkening garden. He was holding a glass of wine, but he hadn't touched it. The exhaustion she had seen months ago had settled into a permanent sort of quietude. She realized then that while she had been busy rebuilding her soul, Elias had been holding up the roof. He had spent years being the anchor, and anchors eventually grow weary of the tide. She walked up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Talk to me," she murmured. Elias leaned back into her, sighing. "I had a dream about the accident last night. Only in the dream, I didn't get there in time. I watched the car slide, and I just stood there. I woke up, and for 5 minutes, I couldn't remember if you were in the other room or if I was finally alone." Clara tightened her grip. The caregiver's trauma was a silent thief. He had spent so long being her hero that he hadn't allowed himself to be a victim of the same tragedy. "We're leaving," she said. Elias turned around, confused. "What? Where?" "Anywhere. A cabin, a beach, a city where nobody knows our names. We've spent a year in this house being a patient and a nurse. I want to spend a week being a wife and a husband. I want to see you without a medical bill in your hand." They went to a small coastal town where the air tasted of salt and the sound of the waves provided a rhythmic backdrop to their conversations. For the first 3 days, they were awkward. Without the routine of recovery, they had to learn how to simply be together. They walked on the beach, and Clara asked him questions that had nothing to do with her memory. "What was your favorite book when you were 10? If you could have dinner with anyone, living or dead, who would it be? What is the one thing you've always wanted to do but were too afraid to try?" Elias began to open up, the layers of husband/protector peeling away to reveal the man beneath. He talked about his failed attempt at being a musician in his 20s, his secret love for old sci-fi movies, and his fear of heights.
On the final night of their trip, they sat on a blanket under a vast, star-studded sky. The ocean was a dark, pulsing beast in front of them. "I have a confession," Elias said, his voice barely audible over the surf. "Tell me, when you were with Julian, before we met, I used to see you at the coffee shop near your old office. You didn't know me. You were always on your phone, looking stressed, looking like you were holding your breath. I remember thinking, I wish I could give that woman a reason to breathe." Clara smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You did more than that. You gave me a reason to stay." "But sometimes," Elias continued, his voice cracking, "I feel guilty. I feel like I took advantage of your memory loss, like I kept the good parts of our life and buried the bad ones to make you love me more." Clara sat up, looking him in the eye. "Elias, listen to me. I read the journals. I know we had arguments. I know we had boring Tuesdays where we barely spoke. I know life wasn't a fairy tale. But memory loss didn't make me love you. It just removed the noise so I could finally hear my own heart." She took his hand and placed it over her chest. "Can you feel that? It's not crying. It's not racing. It's just steady." The return home felt different. The house was no longer a clinical site of recovery. It was just their home. Clara continued her work at the advocacy center, becoming a formidable force in the legal community. She used her lost years as a badge of honor, a reminder that the human spirit is capable of a radical reset. A year later, a letter arrived at the house. It was from a law firm in a different state. Julian had been involved in a domestic dispute and was trying to use Clara's medical history, her amnesia, as a way to discredit her and claim she had falsified reports of his past behavior during their time together. It was his final attempt to reach through the years and grab her throat. Elias watched her as she read the legal threat. He was ready to call their lawyers, ready to build the fortress again. But Clara simply walked to the kitchen, picked up a pen, and wrote a 3-sentence response. "I do not remember the man who wrote this letter. However, I have the journals of the woman who survived him. If you proceed, those journals and my professional testimony on the psychology of abuse will be the only things the court remembers about you. Do not contact us again." She mailed the letter herself. Julian never replied. The fire was finally completely out. As the years passed, Clara's memory never fully returned. There was still gaps, the names of old college friends, the plot of a movie they'd seen in 2018, the taste of a specific wine. But she stopped looking for them. She realized that a life is not a collection of data points. It is a collection of feelings. On their 10th anniversary, Elias took her back to the garden. The lavender was a purple sea, humming with bees. He handed her a small, leather-bound book. "What's this?" she asked. "It's a new journal," he said. "I've been writing in it for the last 9 years. It's all the things you forgot, and all the things we've done since. I wanted you to have a history that didn't hurt." Clara opened the book. It was filled with photos, ticket stubs, and Elias's steady, beautiful handwriting. May 12th. Today, we burned the toast and laughed until we cried. September 4th. You won your first big case. We danced in the kitchen to no music. November 21st. You looked at me today, and I knew, for the first time, that you weren't looking for a memory. You were looking at me. Clara closed the book and looked at her husband, the man who had been a stranger, a nurse, an anchor, and finally, simply, her love. "Elias?" "Yeah?" "I have one more question." He smiled, prepared for the old joke. "Are you crying?" "No," she said, pulling him into a deep, soul-shaking kiss. "I was going to ask if you're ready to start the next volume. I think we're going to need a lot more pages." The ex-husband was gone. The memory was a patchwork quilt of light and shadow. But as they walked back into the house with the blue door, Clara knew that she had achieved something few people ever do.
she had lived 2 lives, and in both of them, she had found the exact same truth. Love isn't about the fire you can't control. It's about the person who stays with you in the ashes until you're ready to build something new. And for Clara and Elias, the building was finally done. Now they just had to live in it. The arrival of Maya was the final anchor. When Clara found out she was pregnant, a new kind of terror took hold of her, a fear that was different from the clinical dread of the hospital. She was terrified that if she could forget a decade of her own life, she might one day wake up and forget the child she had brought into the world. She spent her pregnancy obsessively documenting every sensation, every kick, and every craving in the leather-bound journals Elias had given her. She was building a fortress of paper to protect the person she was becoming. But when Maya was born, something happened that no neurologist could have predicted. As the nurse placed the crying, red-faced infant onto Clara's chest, a floodgate didn't just open, it shattered. It wasn't a memory of Julian or her parents or her old law firm. It was something deeper. It was the primal cellular memory of love. In that moment, Clara realized that while her autobiographical memory was a patchwork of holes, her emotional memory was a vast, indestructible ocean. She looked at Elias, who was weeping silently by the bed, and she realized she didn't need a video of their wedding to know she had chosen him. She could feel the choice in her very marrow. Maya grew up in a house where the gap was simply a part of the family geography, like a room that was permanently locked but didn't affect the structural integrity of the home. She was a child born of the second life, a living testament to the fact that beauty can grow in soil that has been scorched clean. One summer afternoon when Maya was 7, she found Clara in the garden. Clara was sitting on a wooden bench staring at a small rusted key she had found in an old jewelry box. "What's that, Mommy?" Maya asked, leaning against her mother's knee. "I think it's a key to an old apartment I used to live in, before I met Daddy, before the accident." "Do you want to go back and see it?" Clara looked at her daughter, at the bright, curious eyes that were a perfect blend of hers and Elias's. She looked at the house with the blue door, where Elias was currently teaching Maya how to bake bread, just as he had once taught Clara how to live.
"No," Clara said, and she tossed the key into the tall grass near the fence. "That door doesn't need to be opened anymore." The years began to accelerate. Clara's career as an advocate for domestic safety turned her into a local legend. She became the woman who spoke for those who had lost their voices, her own silence having given her a unique resonance. Sarah, the young woman she had helped years ago, eventually became her law partner. They built a firm that wasn't just about winning cases, but about rebuilding lives. Elias, too, found his own peace. He retired from his demanding job and spent his days in the garden and his evenings writing. He became the unofficial historian of their community, a man who understood better than anyone that the stories we tell ourselves are more important than the facts we forget. But time, as it always does, eventually demanded its due. In their late 60s, it was Elias who began to fail. A heart condition that had been a quiet murmur for years became a loud, insistent roar. Clara, who had spent so long being the one who was cared for, stepped into the role of the nurse with a fierce, quiet grace. She didn't need to be taught. She knew exactly how to sit in a hospital room. She knew how to hold a hand so it wouldn't feel alone. She knew the language of the silence. One evening, in the quiet of their bedroom, Elias looked at her. He was thin, his breath shallow, but his eyes were still the same warm, steady lights that had guided her through the fog 40 years ago. "Clara," he whispered. "I'm here, Elias." "I was always so afraid," he confessed, his voice a dry rasp. "Every single day. I was afraid you'd wake up and realize you could do better, that you'd remember the fire and realize I was just a man who liked gardening." Clara leaned down and kissed his forehead, her tears warm against his skin. "Elias, listen to me. I remembered Julian for a long time. Even after the accident, his shadow was there. And you know what I remembered most about him? I remembered that he never made me feel like I was enough." She took his hand and placed it over her heart, just as she had on the beach all those years ago. "You didn't just give me a reason to breathe. You gave me a reason to be me. Not the version of me Julian wanted, or the version of me the world expected. Just me. That was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Elias smiled, a slow, peaceful expression. "I forgot to tell you something." "What's that?" "I remembered the question." Clara tilted her head. "Which question?" "The one you asked Julian. The one that silenced him when he tried to take you back." Clara's heart skipped. "You heard it?" "I was standing in the hallway," Elias admitted. "I was terrified. I thought he had won. And then I heard you ask him, if we were so happy, why is it that in every single memory I have of us, I am crying?" Elias gripped her hand with a final, surprising strength. "That was the moment I knew. I didn't care if you ever remembered my name, Clara. I just wanted to be the man who made sure you never had to ask that question again." Elias passed away 3 days later, in the house with the blue door, surrounded by the scent of lavender and the sound of the wind in the trees. After the funeral, after the well-wishers had left and Maya had gone to put her own children to bed, Clara sat in the garden alone. She was an old woman now, with a lifetime of new memories and a vast, quiet emptiness where a man had been for 40 decades. She felt the old fog trying to creep in, the cold, gray sensation of being lost. For a moment she panicked. She reached for a memory of Elias, desperate to hold on to him. And then she remembered the journals. She went inside and took the very first leather-bound book from the shelf. She opened it to the first page, written in Elias's steady, beautiful hand. "To my Clara, today is the first day of our second life. You don't know me yet, but I promise I am worth the wait." Clara sat by the fireplace and began to read. She read about the coffee with 2 sugars. She read about the dance in the kitchen. She read about the birth of Maya and the trip to the ocean. She read the story of a man who had loved a woman so much he was willing to let her forget him, just so she could find herself. She realized then that Elias was never truly gone. He had written himself into the very fabric of her soul. He had replaced the fire with a permanent, steady light. She picked up a pen and turned to the very last blank page in the very last journal. Her hand was shaky, but her mind was clear. She thought of Julian, the man who had tried to build a love on tears. And she thought of Elias, the man who had built a love on safety. She wrote one final sentence. "Today, I remembered everything that mattered. I was loved by a man who never made me cry, and that was enough to last me 2 lifetimes." Clara closed the book, turned off the lamp, and for the first time in 40 years, she didn't feel the need to look for what she had lost. She simply closed her eyes, and in the perfect, peaceful silence of the house, she went to sleep, knowing exactly who she was and exactly who had loved her. The ex-husband was a ghost, the accident was a catalyst, but the man who stayed, he was the only truth that had ever been real. And in the end, that was the only memory she ever truly needed to keep. In the twilight of her life, Clara lived in a world made of paper and echoes. The house with the blue door had been passed down to Maya, and Clara had moved into a small, sun-drenched cottage on the edge of the property. Her walls were lined with the leather-bound journals, a library of a life reclaimed. At 82, Clara began to notice a new kind of silence. It wasn't the jagged, terrifying void of her youth, but a soft, rhythmic receding of the tide. The doctors called it age. Clara called it the great softening. She wasn't forgetting who she was anymore. She was simply becoming untethered from the when and where. Her granddaughter, Elise, a girl with Elias's quiet curiosity and Clara's stubborn chin, visited her every afternoon. Elise was a student of history, but her favorite subject was the woman sitting in the floral armchair. "Grandma," Elise asked one day, thumbing through the very first journal, "were you ever scared that the old Clara would come back and take over, that you'd wake up and want the fire again?" Clara looked out at the garden, where the lavender was in its third decade of bloom. "For a long time I was," she admitted, her voice like crinkled parchment. "I thought of her as a separate person, a twin sister who had drowned and left me her clothes. But as I got older, I realized she didn't drown. She just finally stopped screaming." Clara reached out and took the journal from Elise. Julian didn't want a woman, he wanted a mirror. He wanted someone to reflect his own chaos back at him. Elias wanted a partner. He wanted someone to walk through the quiet with. It takes a long time to realize that the quiet isn't empty. It's actually where all the music is. That night, after Elise had gone, Clara had a dream. It was the first time in over 50 years that she saw Julian clearly. He was standing in that rain-slicked parking lot from her original memory. He looked young, beautiful, and utterly lost. "Why didn't you choose me?" the dream Julian asked, his voice echoing in the hollows of her mind. "We were legendary. We were the sun."
Clara looked at him, and she felt no anger, no fear, not even a spark of the old attraction. She felt only a profound, distant pity. "The sun is a star that's burning itself out, Julian," she said in the dream. "I didn't want to be legendary. I just wanted to be home." When she woke up, the sun was rising over the coast. Clara felt a strange, light sensation in her chest. She got out of bed, her movements slow but deliberate, and sat at her desk. She opened the very last page of the very last journal, the one she had been writing in since Elias passed. Her hands were trembling more than usual, but she had one final thought to record. Memory is not a recording of what happened. It is the weight of what remains. I have spent half my life in shadows and half in light. The shadows taught me how to see, but the light taught me how to stay. If there is a heaven, I don't want to arrive there with all my memories intact. I want to arrive with only the ones that made me kind. A week later, Maya found Clara in her armchair, facing the window. The sun was warm on her skin, and her eyes were closed. She looked as if she were listening to a conversation only she could hear. On her lap was the first journal Elias had ever given her, open to a photo of the two of them on the beach, their hair wild with salt and their smiles wide with a truth that needed no words. Clara had passed away as she had lived her second life, in peace, in safety, and without a single tear. The funeral was small, held in the garden among the lavender. People from the advocacy center came, women whose lives Clara had saved with her testimony and her strength. They spoke of her not as a woman who had lost her memory, but as a woman who had found her soul. After the service, Elise found a small sealed envelope tucked into the back of Clara's final journal. It was addressed to the one who asks. Elise opened it and found a single small photograph she had never seen before. It was grainy and old, taken shortly after the accident. Clara was in her hospital gown, looking pale and confused, and Elias was sitting beside her, his head leaning against hers. On the back, in Clara's late-life handwriting, were the words, "He told me he was a stranger. He told me I could leave. He gave me every chance to walk away because he didn't want to own me. He wanted to earn me. Julian tried to steal my past, but Elias gave me my future. Remember this, Elise. Love is not the person who makes you feel like you're losing your mind. It's the person who helps you find it when you're lost in the dark." Elise looked up at the house with the blue door, where her mother was hugging her father, and she realized that the question Clara had asked Julian all those years ago had been the most powerful thing of all. It wasn't just a way to silence a ghost, it was a way to define a life. The ex-husband had been a fire that left only ashes, but the husband, the man who stayed, had taken those ashes and turned them into a garden. As the years continued to pass, the story of Clara and Elias became a legend in their family, a map for the heart. It taught the daughters and granddaughters that they didn't have to settle for the intense or the reckless. It taught them that being bored was often just another word for being at peace. And in the end, Clara's memory was preserved far better than any brain could ever manage. It lived on in the lavender that bloomed every spring, in the blue door that never needed a lock, and in the quiet, steady love of a family that knew exactly why they weren't crying. The silence was finally, perfectly complete. Although end of story had been written, the ripples of a life like Clara's do not simply cease when a heart stops beating. A life that reclaimed itself from the ashes of a fire leaves behind a blueprint, and for Elise, the task of archiving her grandmother's journals became a journey into the hidden architecture of that reclamation. A year after Clara's passing, Elise sat in the sun-drenched cottage, surrounded by the leather-bound books. She was preparing them for the university's Women's History Archive, but as she reached the final shelf, she noticed something peculiar about the desk Clara had used for 40 years. In the back of the bottom drawer, tucked behind a false lining that only a curious historian's fingers would find, was a small, tattered notebook that didn't match the others. It wasn't one of the leather-bound journals Elias had given Clara. It was a cheap, spiral-bound notebook from a decade before the accident. Elise opened it, her breath hitching. The handwriting was frantic, spiked with the adrenaline of fear. This was the old Clara, the woman who had been erased. May 12th. I'm sitting in the car outside the office. I can't go in. If I go in, I have to go home. And if I go home, Julian will be there. He said he'd change. He said the broken glass was an accident. But I saw his eyes. He wasn't sorry. He was satisfied. I need a way out. I saw an ad today for a man who handles discreet transitions. His name is Elias. I'm going to call him tomorrow. I'm so tired of being afraid. Elise felt a chill that settled into her bones. Elias. He hadn't just been a man in a coffee shop. He wasn't a stranger who happened to be there when she woke up. She turned the pages, her heart racing. The entries described a series of clandestine meetings. Elias wasn't a romantic interest then. He was a specialist in helping women vanish from toxic lives. He was the one who was supposed to help Clara disappear before Julian could destroy her.
The final entry in the spiral notebook was dated the morning of the accident. I'm meeting Elias at the crossroads at 6 p.m. He has the new papers. He has the plan. Julian suspects something. He's following me in the other car. I have to drive faster. If I can just reach Elias, I'll be safe. Elise dropped the notebook onto the desk. The accident wasn't just a random twist of fate. It happened while Clara was running toward the man who would eventually become her husband. Elias had been waiting at that crossroads. He had watched the car slide. He had been the first one at the wreckage. In that moment, Elise understood the true depth of Elias's silence. When Clara woke up in that hospital and asked, "Do I know you?" Elias had been faced with an impossible choice. He could have told her the truth. "I am the man you hired to help you run away. I am the man who failed to keep you safe." He could have told her that she was fleeing a monster. But Elias had seen the blank slate of her mind as the ultimate gift, the very disappearance she had hired him to provide. He realized that if he told her about the trauma, Julian would always be the center of her story. If he told her he was her discreet transition, she would always be a victim in hiding. So Elias chose to become a stranger. He chose to let her hire him for a lifetime of safety, not with a contract, but with a marriage. He had lived with the guilt of the accident and the secret of their meeting for 40 years, all so Clara could believe she had chosen a safe, boring man out of pure, untainted love. He hadn't just earned her, he had protected her from her own history. Elise walked out into the garden, looking at the lavender. She thought of the question Clara had asked Julian. Why is it that in every single memory I have of us, I am crying? She realized now that Elias had ensured that Clara's memories would be a desert of tears so that he could be the rain. He had allowed himself to be the sedative, the anchor, the stranger, because he knew that the only way for Clara to truly survive Julian was to never have to remember him at all. As Elise stood there, a car pulled into the driveway. It was Julian.
He was an old man now, white-haired and frail, but the predatory glint in his eyes hadn't completely dimmed. He had heard of Clara's death and had come, perhaps, for one last piece of the legendary woman he had lost. "I heard she was gone," Julian said, his voice a gravelly echo of the velvet it had once been. "I thought I'd pay my respects. We were quite the pair, you know, before that gardener stole her mind." Elise looked at the man who had caused her grandmother so much pain, the man who had chased her toward a crossroads and into a wall of stone. She felt the weight of the spiral notebook in her pocket, the evidence of his crimes. She could have shouted it. She could have told him she knew he had followed her that night. She could have fueled the fire. But then Elise remembered the great softening. She remembered the silence. She looked Julian directly in the eye, her face a mirror of Clara's calm strength. "I'm sorry," Elise said, her voice steady and cool. "Do I know you?" Julian blinked, taken aback. I was Julian. I was her husband, the real one." Elise tilted her head, a small, pitying smile on her lips. "I've read every journal she ever wrote. I've seen every photo of her life. I've heard every story she ever told." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of 3 generations. "And I don't see you anywhere in her story. You aren't a husband. You aren't a memory. You're just a man standing in a garden where you don't belong."
Julian opened his mouth to argue, to boast, to ignite the old flame, but he looked into Elise's eyes and saw the same silence that had defeated him decades ago. He saw that he had been so thoroughly erased that even his ghost had no place to haunt. He turned without a word and shuffled back to his car, a footnote finally being struck from the page. Elise watched him drive away. Then she went back to the house. She took the spiral notebook, the last record of the crossroads, and she walked to the fireplace. She thought of Elias, the man who had waited at the intersection of tragedy and hope. She thought of the secret he had kept, the burden he had carried so that his wife could breathe. "Thank you, Grandpa," she whispered. She dropped the notebook into the flames. As the pages curled and turned to ash, the last connection to the old Clara vanished. The truth of the accident, the fear of the chase, and the contract of the discreet transition were gone. What remained was the house with the blue door. What remained was the lavender. And what remained was a history that didn't hurt. The story was finally, truly, and eternally complete. The fire was out, the secret was ash, and the only thing left to do was to live in the light. Elise sat at her grandmother's desk, picked up a fresh pen, and opened her own journal. On the first page, she wrote the only lesson that mattered. Love is not the person who finds you in the light. It is the person who sees you running through the dark and decides to build a home exactly where you fall. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. Years later, when the cottage had been absorbed by the ivy, and the journals had been digitized for a world that desperately needed to believe in the possibility of starting over, the story of the woman with the 2 lives became a quiet legend. The house with the blue door remained in the family, a sanctuary where the air always seemed a little clearer and the nights a little more peaceful. But the true ending of the story didn't happen in a book or a courtroom. It happened in the hearts of the women who came after. Maya, Elise, and the daughters that followed them grew up with a different definition of strength. They didn't look for the fire, they looked for the hearth. They didn't mistake chaos for passion or silence for absence. Because of Clara's great forgotten, they were born with the innate knowledge that their worth was not a thing to be earned through suffering, but a truth to be protected in peace. On a warm spring afternoon, decades after Clara and Elias had both returned to the earth, a young woman stood in the garden. She was Elise's daughter, and she was carrying a small bouquet of fresh lavender. She was about to be married, and she had come to the garden to find a moment of quiet before the ceremony. She sat on the old wooden bench, the same one where Clara had once tossed a rusted key into the grass. She looked at the house, the blue paint now weathered but still vibrant, and she thought about the grandmother she had only known through stories. She thought about the accident, the amnesia, and the man who had been a stranger. She thought about the question that had silenced the monster. Why is it that in every single memory I have of us, I am crying? She realized then that the most beautiful part of the story wasn't that Clara had forgotten her past. It was that she had been loved by a man who made the present so beautiful, the past simply became unnecessary. Her fiancé walked out of the house then. He wasn't a man of grand gestures or loud declarations. He was a man who brought her a glass of water when she was tired, a man who listened more than he spoke, a man who had spent the morning helping her father fix a leak in the roof. "Are you ready?" he asked, standing at the edge of the lavender path. The young woman looked at him, at the steady, quiet warmth in his eyes, the same light that had once guided Clara through the fog. She felt no racing pulse of fear, no jagged edge of uncertainty. She felt only a profound rhythmic sense of Home. Yes, she said, standing up. I'm ready. As they walked toward the house together, a light breeze stirred the lavender, carrying the scent of salt and earth. For a moment, it felt as though the garden itself was exhaling a long-held breath. There were no more secrets to keep. There were no more ghosts to silence. The discreet transition was complete. The trauma of the crossroads had been paved over by 40 years of Tuesdays, by burnt toast and shared laughter, and by the fierce, protective silence of a man who knew that the best way to love someone is to give them a world where they never have to cry. In the end, Clara's memory wasn't lost at all. It was transformed. It had become the foundation of a house that would never fall, a garden that would always bloom, and a family that would never forget the most important lesson of all: that the only history worth keeping is the one that makes you brave enough to love again. The fire was gone. The rain had stopped. The sun had finally come up over the coast, and for the first time in 100 years, everyone was finally, perfectly home. The end.